Thank you all for coming and welcome to this panel on the U.S. constitutional crisis and Europe. I'm Peter Baldwin, a historian by training. I taught for many years at UCLA, but now I'm a Remarque groupie. And for this purpose, I am your Stephanus for the afternoon. Stephanus is detained involuntarily, but on a good mission somewhere south of the Mason-Dixon line. I've forgotten precisely where. And unfortunately can't be with us, and so I'm subbing as best I can for him. We have a very distinguished set of panelists, all of whom are going to be talking about the constitutional crisis, either the US or Europe or both. And I want to introduce them briefly and then set them loose. And I'm going to do so in the order on which they will be speaking, and I'll explain that in a second. So the first is Síofra O'Leary, who is here at NYU as a Hauser Remarque Fellow. She was a judge on the European Court of Human Rights from 2015 to 2024, and indeed was the president of that court between 2022 and 24. She's the author of two books, the first, or one, The Evolving Concept of Community Citizenship, and the other, Employment Law at the European Court of Justice. She will then be followed by Kim Scheppele, who is professor of sociology and international affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and also at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. Boy,
I apologize, my title.
They're long-winded at Princeton, aren't they? Her work focuses on the rise and fall of constitutional democracy, and her books include Legal Secrets, Equality and Efficiency in the Common Law, and 9/11 and the Rise of Global Anti-Terrorism Law, How the UN Security Council Rules the World, which sounds provocative if nothing else. And she has a forthcoming book called, or that will be called, Destroying and Restoring Democracy by Law. And then finally, Sam Issacharoff, who is professor of constitutional law here at NYU's School of Law. He's the author of a book called Fragile Democracies, Contested Power in the Era of Constitutional Courts. And his most recent book is called Democracy Unmoored, Populism and the Corruption of Popular Sovereignty. He's also a leading figure in the field of procedure and complex litigation, and served as a reporter for the American Law Institute's Principles of Aggregate Litigation. He served as well as senior legal advisor to the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama of fond memory. They're appearing in this order for the following tactical reasons. Síofra will talk, I think, mostly about Europe. Kim has a foot on both sides of the Atlantic and has spent time in Hungary and Russia. We'll talk something more comparative, and Sam will focus then more specifically on the US. So, colleagues, if you won't
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to everyone. Thank you also to the wonderful Remarque team that we have the pleasure of working with on a daily basis. I'm sandwiched between two US constitutional law specialists, so I'm going to leave it to them to diagnose the full extent and nature of the current situation in the US. And as Peter said, my role here is to bring European perspectives and experience. You'll notice that these two wonderful speakers are speaking without notes, but judges acquire a very bad habit. They work from paper, and they do so for a reason. The use of the wrong verb or the wrong adjective can lead to recusal. So that's why I cling to my comfort blanket. In the time available, I'd like to do three things. First, to bring you on a short selective tour of Europe, giving you examples of what I would call constitutional corrosion, capture and crisis. Secondly, I'd like to suggest from the snapshots that I'll provide, but also from my experience working as a judge, what seems to work to protect against or counter constitutional decline. In some states like Russia, Hungary, Turkey, and previously Poland, we do see the more extreme forms of what Kim, I think, calls autocratic legalism. But in other states, the crisis is less obvious, less systemic, but nevertheless concerning and consequential. And finally, I'd like to touch on probably the most political aspect of my intervention. And for 10 years, I've been precluded from talking politics. And that's the question of contagion. Contagion within Europe, but also contagion from across the pond towards Europe. The US influence in Europe is, as you know, long-lasting and profound. So I think it's worth reflecting on what, apart from tariffs, you may be exporting to Europe at the present and for the future. And I think we have to see that when a state is in crisis, and we'll be discussing, of course, today, is your state in crisis? There is a risk that insularity beckons, that you look inwards at your own problems. But your position in the world is such that I think all Europeans here present would actually plead with you not to look inward. Before I tackle my 3 points, I think it's useful for a US audience to just present you with how this democratic moment in your history is being represented in the European press. Now, of course, your president and his policies find their supporters in different parts of Europe, as Kim in particular will explain, and there are politicians who wish to emulate him. But what I'm about to read is an extract from a weekly broadsheet that you will find in most European states, as I said, on a daily, weekly, certainly monthly basis. And I don't reproduce it to offend anyone or to call into question the votes cast by US citizens in the last election. This is from the Irish Times in October. The fabric of American democracy is disintegrating. Packing courts, deploying troops in the streets, prosecuting political critics and erstwhile allies, threatening to delicense broadcast networks, suing media for billions of dollars, abusing the presidency to flout cryptocurrency scams to enrich the first family, betraying allies and appeasing powerful opponents, and convening a toe-curling meeting of America's military generals to hear their commander-in-chief's demented meanderings. All point to disintegration, not greatness. These are not my words, I stress. They are the words of a journalist. Turning to my first point, which is Europe's decade-long or over a decade experience of constitutional corrosion, capture, and crisis. I'm going to just mention 2 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights in relation to the Russian Federation. Novaya Gazeta is a case in which the court found several violations of the convention from the application to journalists and ordinary citizens of legislation adopted very quickly in the days following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The Russian legislation criminalized statements which discredited what was referred to as Russia's special military operation and fake news, a term which will be very familiar to the Americans present. The Novaya Gazeta judgment and other judgments like Echo Defense, which related to Russia's foreign agents law, illustrate absolutely perfectly the gradual suffocation through 1,000 different legal regulations adjusted and tightened over time of political space in the Russian Federation, but also of the private space of Russian citizens. Russia devised, perfected, and exported autocratic legalism, and the court which I served in Strasbourg grappled for well over a decade trying to understand how was it going to handle this situation. But I'm deliberately not using Russia as an example, because in my experience, if you tell people from venerated and venerable democracies like yours that their system or their society is susceptible to similar decline, they will simply think that you're talking from another planet. So I'm going to start my tour with a state that you know very well, the United Kingdom, and a state in which there is no Putin, no Orban, no Erdogan, at least not yet. The UK is a state in which I would contend over a decade, and there's a UK constitutional expert here, so he can refute the claim. It's a state which has seen signs of constitutional corrosion as it grappled particularly with transformational votes on Scottish independence and the exit from the European Union. And following the EU referendum, which one should remember for the lawyers present and also the political scientists, was intended to be a purely advisory referendum, the government sought to trigger the exit process from the European Union without gaining the consent of Parliament. And this provoked a case before the High Court of England and Wales, a case called Miller 1, in which the central question was precisely the same question which is presently before the US Supreme Court in a number of different important cases, namely the limits to executive authority. The High Court ruled at first instance that the government couldn't pull the trigger on its own and that it required parliamentary approval. But what's relevant in terms of constitutional corrosion is not just the attempt by the executive to bypass the parliament, but also what happened next. The 3 judges were deemed in bold newspaper headlines to be, and I quote, enemies of the people. And the sexual orientation of one of them was paraded as a means to further emphasize the depth of his treason. In the UK, a government minister called the Lord Chancellor is responsible for the defense of the judiciary and for the defense of judicial independence. But the Lord Chancellor at the time remained entirely silent and took some time before issuing a bland statement. By the way, she went on to become the Prime Minister and is famously known for the fact that the duration of her mandate as Prime Minister was shorter than the shelf life of a lettuce. For those of you who read the UK press, you'll know what I mean. But the Miller judgment, which was confirmed by the Supreme Court, and the judges who decided the cases were depicted by politicians and by the press alike as being entirely undemocratic. And judicial muscularity was again on display in a second case, Miller 2. This was a case brought when the next Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, prorogued Parliament in order to suspend parliamentary debate for 5 weeks on the Brexit issue. And the UK Supreme Court, led by Lady Hale, some of you may know the case and have seen the image, famously wearing a spider brooch on her lapel, which she claimed was entirely innocent, but I have my doubts. The UK Supreme Court held unanimously that the question before it was justiciable, it could be decided by a court, and that the Prime Minister had acted unlawfully. The prorogation had had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions as the body responsible for supervising the executive. And the Prime Minister's advice to the Queen to prorogue was deemed, and I quote, unlawful, void and of no effect. The British, as you know, are understated souls, but the understatement and the unanimity in the judgment enhanced its power and its purpose. What the judges did was they called out the use and abuse of constitutional convention. And on both occasions, the UK Supreme Court stepped in to preserve for Parliament its parliamentary role. And on both occasions, I think it's fair to say that the British discovered that an unwritten constitution, which depends on good chaps behaving like good chaps and respecting checks and balances, may be a very fragile construct indeed. But it's difficult to turn the clock back when the work of judges and courts is politicized and polemicized. And the Lady Chief Justice this year has denounced sensationalist and inaccurate abuse and grave threats and intimidation to judges previously unseen in the UK system. As regards the graver forms of constitutional capture, Kim will speak to Hungary, so I won't. But of course, we have Turkey, particularly following the attempted coup d'etat in 2016, where you've had thousands and thousands of civil servants, teachers, judges who have been dismissed, prosecuted and convicted, many on charges of terrorism. And when I say thousands, we dealt with a case in the Grand Chamber of 17 judges, that's the largest judicial formation, which was a lead case on which 8,000 other cases before the court depended. The cases heard at national level are heard by courts in relation to whom there are multiple complaints of lack of independence and impartiality. And of course, crucially, leading opposition figures have been charged and convicted and detained for different reasons, despite European court judgments finding very clearly that the charges and the convictions are unlawful. As many of you know, the mayor of Istanbul is now standing on charges of, I think, 140 different offences, and his university credentials have been withdrawn. So even if the charges are dropped, he no longer is eligible to stand. And finally, crisis. Sadly, there are too many examples to give you, but I'm going for the unusual suspects. That's why I chose the UK. So I'll start with Romania. In December 2024, the Romanian Constitutional Court annulled the first round of presidential elections on the basis of declassified information from the Romanian security services of widespread cyber attacks by state and non-state entities. I leave you guess which state entities were highlighted. The first place candidate in the first round, who was a previously little known figure, had benefited from massive exposure and preferential treatment via automated bots on TikTok. And the Romanian Constitutional Court held, and I quote, "The state has a positive responsibility to prevent any undue interference in the electoral process and an obligation," this is the crucial part, "to build resilience amongst voters, including by raising public awareness about the use of digital technologies." Now, as a lawyer, I have to say, and a judge, I don't find it revolutionary that a court finds that to hold elections which are free and fair, voters have the right to be properly informed. But in the face of concerted opposition to regulation of big tech in Europe, this judgment does actually have revolutionary consequences if you think about it. Turning to another unusual suspect, and there's a Spanish constitutional lawyer with us today. You probably know of Spain as a country, rightly, you associated with sun, fun, tapas, and maybe sangria. But unfortunately, at present, Spain displays numerous harbingers of democratic demise. Political polarization, which is acute. In my family in law, I'm married to a Spaniard, we never talk politics. Politicization of the justice system, the demise in traditional political parties and other parties which have risen up but aren't functioning with the same organizational skills of traditional political parties, and widespread corruption. The public prosecutor was recently convicted of leaking information regarding a tax probe which implicated a political opponent. So after giving you such a depressing whistle-stop tour of Europe, can Europe point us to examples of what legal, political, or social mechanisms actually have worked best to stymie instances of crisis and decline? What I'm about to say isn't groundbreaking or revolutionary, I'm very sorry, but it does come from working at a court with over 60,000 cases, in which you could clearly see that the difference between states with thousands and thousands of cases pending, and other states like Germany, Ireland, and the UK, with very low numbers of complaints introduced against them, can be located somewhere in the following factors. The first is pretty commonplace, but sadly in short supply in some countries. An effective democracy underpinned by the rule of law cannot work without an independent and impartial judiciary. I think the UK courts provided a very good example of courts stepping in to curb the executive's intentional disregard of constitutional conventions. However, where courts do step in as the final rampart, this can create difficulties in terms of their own authority and their own legitimacy. Courts can curb constitutional crisis, but they cannot alone stop a deliberate and orchestrated downward trajectory. What works, if courts do step in, is not simply tinkering with procedural irregularities, but instead they have to address the systemic problems, if necessary, with judicial muscle. I read this morning the 5-paragraph order in the gerrymandering case that came out yesterday, a case called Abbott, and I have to say that from a European perspective, it just makes no sense at all, but I leave it to the experts to explain it for us.
An American perspective too.
What is also essential to preserving a culture of respect for the judiciary is the existence of strict rules, and I mean really strict rules on judicial ethics, and the enforcement of those rules by judges themselves, which means no flags flying in funny ways at funny times, no junkets, no gifts. If you don't have those rules in place, the integrity of the judiciary can be attacked very, very easily. The second thing I would say is the existence of independent, informed and informative media, civil society bodies, and crucially, academics, fact-checking and pushing back. It's worth remembering the successful strategies adopted in Poland and in Israel prior to the 7th of October by judges, academics, and civil society. They stood against judicial reforms whose purpose was to undermine judicial independence and disactivate constitutional checks on the exercise of executive power. And what they did was they engaged with society, clarifying, educating, showing people that they had to be alert to democratically dangerous but ostensibly legal changes being introduced to their constitutional system. Social mobilization matters. It's how you mobilize that is difficult. The third point I would make, which is applicable to Europe but more difficult in relation to the US, is that it helps when the actions of backsliding states can be subject to external review, whether political or judicial, if only to bide enough time for voters to have their say in the next democratic round. And this is something that Europe benefits from in the form of the European Union and the Council of Europe and the courts located in Luxembourg and Strasbourg. I know that Kim and many of her fellow writers have complained, I think quite rightly, that sometimes it's too little, too late. But in fact, if you look at what Europe has and what other regions don't have, you see the benefits of the European system, however faulty they are. And finally, independent regulatory bodies. Again, these issues are before the US Supreme Court right now, from electoral commissions to broadcasting authorities. This is the institutional infrastructure which ensures that the next elections can be fair, free, and as frequent as the Constitution requires them to be. And finally, I'll finish up on contagion. Within Europe, the speed of contagion, its stealth in some instances, and its nature has been quite remarkable. Think of Russia, Hungary, Georgia, and the Slovak Republic, and I'm just mentioning the usual subjects. But contagion is transatlantic. Europe for many, many years has regarded the major threats to the EU and European democracies as coming from the East and manifesting themselves in extraterritorial poisonings, drones, damage to underwater cables, and electoral interference, to name but a few. But this is where I step a tiny little baby foot into politics. This year, Europeans have watched on as the president of Ukraine was received in the Oval Office. They heard the speech of the vice president at the Munich Security Conference. They've been treated to very clear signal messages exchanged following the Yemen bombings, and they've observed the exclusionary, and I think one could say mercantile flavor of peace negotiations in relation to war taking place on Europe's doorstep. This is a war which the EU has financed to the tune of over 166 billion, and a war which has seen millions of displaced Ukrainians taken into other European states and into Europeans' homes. So Europeans have spent the last year coming to terms with the appearance or the realization that there are now threats where they never imagined that threats would lurk. And if you add to this different forms of low-grade harassment, such as the defamation suit against the BBC or the constant pushback against EU regulations relating to digital services and media, or I could even suggest the humiliation of the President of the European Commission at a privately owned golf course in Scotland, which is no longer in the EU's territory, the alarm that I referenced in the early newspaper piece is even more heightened as the year comes to an end. It's a reflection, a realization that any contagion, it isn't incidental. It is rather deliberate and orchestrated. And I wrote those words in the conclusion before I read this morning in the newspaper an extract from the National Security Strategy, which expressly speaks of, and I quote, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory. And European governments, I quote, subversion of democratic process. Thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the specialists, but also to our exchanges.
My goodness, that was wonderful. I think we should applaud. And a very tough act to follow. So let me start by just saying also where I come from, which is I spent a lot of time after the Berlin Wall came down. I spent much of the 90s living and working in Hungary, and I see Jane and Fred. I said goodbye to you guys at Michigan. Here you are. And moved to Hungary, worked at the Constitutional Court at a moment when it seemed like democracy was inevitable, on the rise, and permanent. I then moved to Russia, worked in the Russian Constitutional Court for a year before it was captured and beaten down. Those were hopeful moments, and yet during the time I was living there, one of the things I learned apart from the law and the languages is how easy it is for democracies, even established democracies, to be undermined, but not in the usual ways. And this is where I think a lot of people were not on their guard to understand the new forms of democratic undermining. It used to be that democracies fell by a coup, sort of tanks in the street, some irregular movement or some irregular takeover of leadership by some pretender who gained access by force or violence or something of that kind. That was the dominant way in which democracies fell during the Cold War, often as a result of proxy battles between the US and the Soviet Union. The landscape is now very different. Almost all of the aspirational autocrats who have come to power and really seriously harmed their democratic systems have been brought into power through elections that election observers have said were very largely free and fair. I've been spending a lot of time going back through all of those kind of, election monitoring. Election monitoring is not catching what's going on. These leaders come to power. The ones who are the most successful actually tend to consolidate their power by law, if possible, to pass laws in an ordinary way through a parliament, if not, to intimidate the parliament and govern by decree, to engage in massive judicial reform and install their loyalists in judicial positions, and otherwise undermine all the checks and balances. let me just say for the record, as someone who teaches sometimes in law schools and sometimes in social science departments, sometimes here, sometimes in Europe, that what a lot of us were celebrating, after in this sort of democratic renaissance was actually the expansion of rights. And rights matter, but they aren't the first line of attack in a lot of these autocratizing societies. What the first line of attack are all the constraints on executive power. And those are things that many people are not trained to see. So let me just say, like living in Russia, for example, I was there in the early 2000s. Vladimir Putin had just come to power. People forget that there was a lot of hope at that time at the Constitutional Court. There was a lot of hope because he was saying to the Constitutional Court, I really want you to actually enforce the Constitution. He was giving them extra resources. He was actually supporting their work. He looked like the good guy. And then things started to change. So one trajectory that you see is that, and this was the Erdogan story as well. He was the guy who was going to join the EU, who actually got rid of the military tribunals, who tried to strengthen the Constitutional Court, at least at the beginning. That was the rationale, and so on. And so he looked like a good guy and then pivoted. So one of the rationales that you sometimes see is that the good guy who pivots, and therefore it's very hard to see what it was that was the pivot point until you see it in retrospect. The other pattern, though, you see in Hungary and now actually in the US, which is leader comes to power, especially a leader who was in power once, voted out, does not really accept the results of the elections, plans when out of power because they by now know, or their advisors know, how power is structured to get into power and never lose it again. And this was what Viktor Orban did. He planned, actually what he did was they sort of planned an entire new legal system for Hungary, farmed out pieces of it to little law firms that were all over the country so that no one law firm, as they're drafting a law on X, Y, or Z, could see it was like a jigsaw and they couldn't see what the whole puzzle looked like. Comes into power, and Orban basically closed down democracy in Hungary within 3 years. It took another 7 years or so before the rest of the world had figured that out, but basically all of the independent authorities in Hungary were captured within the first 3 years, the last one being the Constitutional Court. So how did that all work? Well, if it's done by law, particularly if it's done by law by passing things through the parliament or by using ordinary legal measures, again, these are technical things that happen in the small print of very dense legislation. And most Hungarians were missing what was going on unless they were directly affected. But what Viktor Orban did, the blitz part of what he did, are things that may seem now familiar because, in fact, Viktor Orban's been a consultant on what the US is going through now. Actually, let me pull back as I'm about to say this. Here's one little thing to know. Project 2025, which was the outline for the Trump administration, sort of detailed plan of autocratic takeover, borrows heavily from Orban's method, and it isn't accidental, as we say. Viktor Orban's English language think tank, the Danube Institute, was one of the partners with the Heritage Foundation in writing this. So actually the coincidence, it's not accidental. So here are the pieces that Trump borrowed from Orban. Let me tell you the Orban story first. The first is analyzing the national budget to figure out all of the ways in which the national budget supports everyone who might be opposed to your autocratic takeover. And from the minute you walk into the job, you defund everybody all at once. That happened in Hungary. It turned out that the media, there's a very vibrant media space, 11 daily newspapers in Budapest at the time that Orban started, lots of TV news. There was just a ton of media ecosystem. Much of it was supported by state advertising. And what Orban did on day one was to cut all the advertising to the media that were independent or oppositional and boosted the advertising to all the media outlets that operated in his favor. Universities cut by 40% in the first 2 years, and Hungary, like most European countries, almost all the universities are public universities, and so that's really a substantial leverage you can exercise over universities. They cut a lot of the NGOs were funded from a civil sector fund because after the end of Soviet rule in that part of the world, I'm sorry, I'm just watching. I have been living with death threats for 15 years. So when things happen out the window, I actually look, because I work on Hungary. But anyway, so what was, happening at the end of the Soviet period, philanthropists came in, foundations came in, funded the growth of the civil sector. And then as democracy moved further east, they all left places like Hungary and went to places like Russia and then went to Central Asia, leaving behind a defunded civil sector. So what happened in Hungary, as this also happened in Poland, is that you get these national funds that support the NGO sector. Orban cut all of that overnight to any of the groups who might be oppositional, funding the ones who were favored, and on through the entire budgetary cycle. It turned out that much of what passed for a vibrant democracy in Hungary was funded from the state budget. So while everybody's scrambling around trying to figure out how to keep their universities afloat and which faculty are going to get fired, which NGOs are going to continue, can you write grant proposals to somewhere else? While all that's happening, then Orban shovels through the parliament massive amounts of legislation. At the end of a year and a half, and several, I don't know, maybe something like 20,000 pages of legislation, the entire Hungarian legal landscape was transformed. Let me give you a couple of examples of how the autocratic capture happened. In the first week that Orban came to power, he came to power in a disproportionate election system. He won 53% of the vote, got 67% of the seats. Unicameral parliament in which a single 2/3 vote of the unicameral parliament could change the constitution. The first two constitutional amendments, Constitutional Amendment 1, let's cut the size of the parliament in half. It had been discussed for years. It was a huge parliament. Even the opposition voted for that. And then Orban turned to all of his people in the parliament and said, half of you will not be here after the next election. If you want to be considered for a seat running with my party, you will vote for everything I put in front of you. That was Amendment 1. Amendment 2 said there was a provision of the Constitution that said, if you're going to change the whole Constitution, you need a 4/5 vote of the parliament, not the 2/3 vote. They used the 2/3 vote to amend out the 4/5 rule. Those two things happened in the first week. You could see immediately what was going to go on. And after that, the Constitution was amended 12 times in the first year to pave the way for the introduction of a new Constitution and a lot of new legislation that went with it. Orban was smart enough not to put the worst stuff in the Constitution because he knew lots of people would read it. It would be translated. Constitutional lawyers tend to think that only the Constitution is a Constitution. A lot of the bad stuff was hidden in what were called the cardinal laws, which were the laws giving detailed meaning to the constitutional provisions. All of that was done in the first 2 years, and basically Hungary was just captured. The opposite, they changed the election laws, and no one could win after that. Because part of the reason for telling you that is what also came with this was mass firing of civil servants. What also came with this was capturing the judiciary. Now, when Orban came into power, the judiciary was quite independent, so he had to figure out a way to capture the judiciary. He borrowed the same trick that Mr. Erdogan in Turkey had used, right? Which is, let's flood the highest court with a new German-style constitutional complaint. It's a European audience. I don't know if you know what that means, but it means that individuals can go to the constitutional court to claim that their individual rights have been violated. That was not an option in Turkey or in Hungary, where the constitutional court could only handle more structural kinds of questions. Suddenly, you give the constitutional court the ability to take all these thousands of human rights cases, you flood the court, and then you say, gee, we're such defenders of the court, they need more judges. And then you bring in your judges, right? So Erdogan did that in Turkey, and then Orban borrowed it in Hungary. So takeover of the constitutional court, pushing this down through judicial reform to the ordinary courts, and again, just compromising first the court presidents and then the ordinary judiciary. And we can talk about how that happened. Capturing the public prosecutor's office, capturing the tax authority to put people under tax audits, capturing the police, the military, and the intelligence services to make sure that they were, and turning domestic spying inwards on the opposition, for example. The media. So after the media had been defunded by losing their state funds, Orban's oligarchs swooped in and bought up a lot of the media. And therefore, you start getting an echo chamber with nothing else going on. The civil sector's defunded. A lot of the groups just left and they couldn't really function anymore. And then, again, rewriting the election laws. So that was the Orban strategy. So then I'm going to just take it across the Atlantic. Orban obviously has had very deep connections with the Trump administration. This goes back to the first Trump term. Orban, endorsed Trump, Trump endorsed Orban, and so on. And you saw from the fact that Mr. Orban was visiting the White House a few weeks ago that they remain in close touch. But this ability of Orban's people to work with Trump's people on Project 2025 meant that as soon as the Trump government hit the ground running, it was a repeat of Hungary from 2010, defunding all of the opposition. Again, this is, and we've seen it with universities, threatening the opposition with lawsuits. So we've seen this with, again, civil sector groups, but also law firms and so on. Capturing the courts. A lot of that was done in Trump's first term with getting, 3 judges on the Supreme Court, 2 of whom were appointed under irregular circumstances. The lower court judges here are holding the line against Trump. And then, as happened yesterday, these cases go up to the Supreme Court on technical procedural matters, and the court will side with Trump on the basis of no reasoning at all. And I think yesterday was the 27th such case. That said, not all hope is lost. There's still about 150 injunctions out there that have not been overturned, but it's unclear whether Trump is actually following them. And the fact that he's captured the Justice Department means that nobody can tell. So that blitz approach puts everybody off. The same thing happened here that happened in Hungary, which is the first few months, everybody's running around and they can't figure out what to do because everyone's just trying to figure out how to preserve their own little thing that got cut. And here what we're seeing, and this is where I think the US is quite different than Hungary, we're seeing, I think, now a kind of democratic uprising. And that's because there's a way in which what's happening in the US is very different than what happened in Hungary. And that is that Orban did all this stuff in the small print of legislation passed in the dark of night that nobody could read. There was not that much, there was some violence. Orban's football hooligans would beat up Roma and so on, but there was no public violence during this time of autocratic consolidation. The fact that Trump has now been engaged in what I call the cruelty agenda. This is the immigration agenda. This is the mass people, snatching people off the streets, tanks in the streets, troops out. That's different. And that, I think, has mobilized a lot of Americans because that looks like dictatorship. And all the other stuff that Trump was doing, my guess is that he might have gotten away with it were it not for this cruelty agenda that has brought people to the streets, that has increased the turnout at the elections that we've seen so far. What America is spectacularly missing is leadership of all these folks who want to rise up and do something. And so the leadership has been disabled by a lot of the things that Orban did, which is you knock the big law firms out of defending these cases, against Trump. You knock the universities out of actually providing the critical commentary because everybody's afraid their university is going to get hit. You sort of knock out a lot of the people who could condense, consolidate, and figure out how to mobilize the actions that's all out there. But this is where, again, America is very different than Europe. One last point. In Hungary, and also then in Poland, I haven't had a chance to go into that. That was a slow motion. Well, it was fast in some ways, but it wasn't as legal. The fact that the EU and the European human rights system were above these countries put, I think, a floor beneath which they couldn't fall. It's very different than, say, the human rights system didn't help so much in Russia and Turkey, but certainly I think the EU kept Hungary and Poland more in line. Ultimately, those of us who worked on this system for a long time were able to get the EU to cut all the funds that subsidized these dictatorships in Hungary and the almost dictatorship in Poland. And I think that broke open the political system and was really helpful. We don't have those transnational institutions to rely on here in the US. So I'm going to leave my American friends with one thought. Autocrats attack their national constitutional orders, and it's very helpful to have multi-layer systems. We don't have a layer up, we do have a layer down. And what we're seeing now in the US is that some of the most active and important litigators and people who were pushing back are the blue state attorneys general, the blue state governors, and blue state legislatures. And so for those of you looking for things to do, if you're frustrated at national level, if you're in a blue state, this is a resource. And I think a lot of us are now moving to the state level to figure out how to use the weaponization, how to weaponize, in some sense, state governments against what's happening at federal level. So some things are the same, some things are different, but unfortunately there was a huge transplant of Orban here. And I think you're absolutely right to say now there's unfortunately, a current going back. The US never falls all by itself. Thank you.
A few years back, I was in Santiago, Chile. And it was shortly before the first constitutional referendum, first of two that they had down there. And I was having lunch with a colleague a law professor at the Católica Law School. And she recounted an experience that she had that day going to pick up medicines, that regular prescription that she's been on for years. And she went to the drugstore and she said, "Oh my God, it jumped so much in price since the last time I bought it." And the pharmacist said to her, "Don't worry, ma'am. Soon we will have constitutional reform, and then this won't be a problem anymore." And this is a process that I have come to see as constitutional fantasy. And it is the reason that I resist the term constitutional crisis for a phenomenon which I think is a collapse of the institutions of democratic politics and only marginally related to the particular constitutional structure of any country. And part of what I'm going to describe is the similarity, as the two presentations before have done, of what's going on across many, many countries. And once you start seeing a similar phenomenon present itself in different constitutional structures or constitutional media, it's hard to make the causal argument that it's the form of constitutionalism or the limitations of constitutionalism that are at issue here. So this constitutional fantasy is of the following sort, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on Latin America. And the constitutional fantasy is of the following sort. Peru has just about become a failed state. It's teetering on the edge of whether the central functionalities of the state exist or not. They've had 4 or 5 presidents. Nobody really cares to keep track in the last year. And it's a complete disaster of the governing structure. So what's one of the sources of discussions of the opposition there? We need a new constitution. Well, what exactly do they want through this new constitutional order? They want the same thing as the Chilean pharmacist who wants stable prices, doesn't have a mechanism to get it, doesn't know or doesn't confide in the democratic process to be responsive to the needs of the population, and so seeks to substitute a from on high approach of we should just constitutionalize things and then we can take it off the domain, out of the domain of politics altogether. And so even though I'm here as the American constitutional lawyer, I'm going to downplay the role of constitutionalism. And let me give you an example for this. And it predates Orban, because in my writings, I refer to this process of legal autocratization as the Chavez handbook. Because if you go down to South America in the 1990s, where the current populist wave really began, although it began more as left-wing populism than as the right-wing populism that we see more centrally in Eastern Europe now, and then all kinds of populist impulses that are very hard to pigeonhole on the left-right spectrum. But if you go to what Chavez did, he went on 2 tracks. One was to try to, after he took power, to follow major constitutional reform and to reorganize the institutions of government. So the other was to achieve the same aims through ordinary law. It turned out the constitutional approach created huge backlash, was difficult to implement, was legally problematic. And then he discovered that he didn't have to shut down the opposing media. He would just bring tons of defamation actions against them. He didn't have to prescribe opposition newspapers. He would just announce that the government's Hora del Comandante, the hour-long program where he would go on TV at night to sing and dance and tell jokes and all this, which was preemptively announced just a half hour before as the hour of the commandante, and would often run 2, 3, 4 hours. And give him his due, he was witty and charming, unlike many of our contemporary populist leaders. And the result would be to bankrupt the news station, the broadcasters, who were also the major newspapers, because this was their prime advertising revenue. Well, what do you do when you lose a whole lot of money? You get substitutes. What's the substitute? Government ads. But the government ads were only available for allies and not for opponents. And so this put huge financial pressure on the independent media. And you see in Chavez, by fits and starts, trying to figure out all the ways in which ordinary law could be mobilized to weaken the political opposition. Now, it turned out major constitutional reforms were not necessary to accomplish this. Some places you do need constitutional reform. So I spent a fair amount of time last year in Germany, and Germany was going through the debates about, do we have to rearm? What's going to be our defense against Russia? Can we trust the United States to uphold its NATO commitments, et cetera? And that required an overhaul of the German constitution, which was designed to prohibit it from ever becoming a militarized state again. So if that's the objective, yes, then you have a constitutional crisis, because the Constitution is supposed to mandate the contrary. For the most part, the constitutions in most advanced democratic countries take a form of settled institutional arrangements. This is a very Dicey view of a constitutional order. It's the extreme form is Gladstone saying it's all the good faith of the people who operate it. But it's not just Gladstone who says things like that. You find that through all constitutional regimes, including the decisions of the American Supreme Court, recognizing that when Congress and the president have signed off on institutional ways of doing things, there's at least a presumption in favor of their propriety and constitutionality. Well, what's the opposite then of a constitutional crisis? The opposite is when the institutions that make the constitutional order work in terms of delivering stable, expanding democratic governance, when the institutions start to fail. And then the question becomes whether that's a constitutional question or a matter of democratic politics that has to be addressed on different terms. So my view is that the period of democratic ascendancy, which is basically from 1800 to 2000, you quibble on where to start, where to end, but basically that's the period in which democracy becomes stabilized in the United States. It leads to the Reform Acts in Britain of the 19th century, and it leads to a period until the end of the Cold War in which, that really seemed to be the future of humanity. And then we've had 20 years of retrocession since. What was the defining feature of that period in country after country after country? It was the stability of Parliament, of the legislative branch, as the center of democratic governance. That's where negotiations took place. That's where stable political parties advanced agendas in the legislative setting so they could mobilize their supporters below. And why were these parties successful at doing that? Because it was understood they spoke for someone. What did that mean? That means every democratic country had some variant of labor, social democrats, Democrats in the US, who were basically rooted in labor unions and other kinds of more popular organizations. And then you had another party, which was the conservatives, the Tories, the Christian Democrats, the Republicans, that tended to be rooted in local chambers of commerce, in local civic and business organizations. These were thick institutional arrangements that went all the way from the citizenry up to the organs of government. The great failing of imagination of our founders in the United States was that they understood that they had to fractionate power in some sense to avoid the risk of majoritarian tyranny, to avoid the risk of an over-elaborate, over-aggressive executive. They thought the only divisions were up at the top between the ambitions of Congress against the executive, against the judiciary, against the states. And what democracy quickly discovered, and this is, I'm drawing down a great talk I heard Turku give a month or two ago at Princeton. If you look at Tocqueville, what is most striking about the appearance of early democratic America is all these civic institutions that somehow were woven together into a fabric of democratic governance. And this carried over. So, you know, in my lifetime, what has been English democracy? It's Tories versus Labor. What has been French democracy after the Fifth Republic? It's Gaullist versus Socialist. What has been Italian democracy? It's socialist with a little bit of the Euro communist behind it against the Christian Democrats. But it's an overlapping Congress, the Congress Party in India. These are institutions that define the democratic commitment. And what's key in our time right now is that in every single democratic country, and there's a couple of exceptions here, there, basically these mass institutional parties have collapsed. They don't exist. They don't have a stable legislative presence, which means they don't legislate. If you look at the history of the first 100 days of the American presidency, which is a measure we've been using since FDR, you see that the amount of legislative activity goes down and down and down from about 100 to 5 in pieces of legislation, only 2 of which were real pieces of legislation in Trump's first 100 days. But the number of executive orders is now over 150 issued by Trump in the first 100 days of his administration. You have a collapse of the legislative branch. You have a rise of executive unilateral authority, decretal authority. And this is not just in the heavy duty backsliding cases, countries, I mean, like Hungary, Poland, Turkey, but in Britain, in the United States, in every one of these countries, you get this. And that's why I fully agree. The Miller decisions were just extraordinary pieces of judicial craftsmanship because they didn't purport to claim a new constitutional authority. They claimed to defend the institutions of democratic politics so that these critical matters such as Brexit and so forth could be resolved as a matter within a stable democratic order. So to my mind, the key problem is that these political parties were able to stabilize democratic governance and deliver the goods. And that's key, delivering the goods. People want stuff. They want their plumbing to work. They want their roads to be paved. Even in Germany now, they would love a train to come every so often. You know, this is delivering the goods, but it was based on the fact that these parties spoke for something. And what has happened to these parties? It's not that they've fissured at the legislative level. Partially it's social media, partially you can create your own supporters, your own financial base. You don't need the parties in the same way, but largely it's because the underlying institutions have collapsed. Where are the trade unions? Where are the churches? Where are the local civic institutions? And the challenge, I think, of the moment is not in our constitutional design. Maybe we could do things differently, but we're having the same problem under such variety, presidential, semi-presidential, parliamentary. We have the same set of problems presenting country after country, regardless of the formal constitutional structure. You know, at one point, Putin decided, he was tired of being prime minister. He was going to be president, then he switched back. And the only person in the world who thought it made a difference was Medvedev. And he was soon disabused of that fantasy. It didn't matter in Turkey when the forms were changed. It didn't matter in Poland that the Constitution could never be amended by peace. They found other ways of doing it. So my view of this is that we are in a moment where the way we've done democratic politics for the last 2 centuries is really in disrepair. And there's new organizational forms that are going to emerge from this. I cannot pretend to know what they are. I don't know how fully disruptive social media will prove to be. I don't know whether the politics of immediacy that it generates will lead us in a more plebiscitary direction for our democracy. I don't know whether executive domination will prove to be the stable next form of democratic governance as opposed to legislative primacy. I don't know. But all of those are on the table. It seems to me that very relatively small part of that is the Constitution. And let me just finish with one point about constitutional fantasy. I think constitutional fantasy, whether the Chilean pharmacists or the Peruvians who have no idea how to reconstitute a state, the problem with constitutional fantasy is that it creates the idea that there's a substitute for politics in a democratic society. And so what do you do about Trump coming back? Hell, we have the Colorado Supreme Court, it's all Democratic. Let's ban him, right? What about Trump coming back? Well, you don't even need the Supreme Court. You can have the Maine Secretary of State ban Trump. Why not? How about AFD? What do we do about the fact that all of East Germany, as it was formerly constituted, is now, a solid block of massive and to my mind, horrifying support for the AFD? You ban the AFD. These are fantasies. This is failing to engage in real democratic politics, which is hard and it's uncertain because the institutions just don't seem to be there the same way. So.
Thank you, panelists, for 3 talks that were, I think it's fair to say, fascinating and horrifying, more or less in equal measure. It's rare, I think, all of those of us in the audience can agree, it's rare to hear a panel that is not only about a topic of such crucial importance, but also so extraordinarily focused, where all the panelists are actually talking about the same thing. That, in my experience, is a rare bird in the academic world. So kudos to the absent Stefanos and the team at Remarque for putting the 3 of you together. This was truly fascinating. Now, having said that, what I'd like to do, we have half an hour. Before we turn it over to the audience, you have each had a say. You've now heard what the others had to say. Not all of you will agree with all this. I'm wondering if we could have a sort of 2-minute round so you can have another whack at each other, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Do you want to start?
I actually have a question for Sam, because I think you've identified really a common thread, because how do you identify similar something happened in the UK, in Spain, in Hungary, in Poland, and you've identified something really important. You highlight the decline of trade unions, church, and civil organizations. But were there not other seismic shocks in that first decade of this century which contributed to that decline, which is how difficult it is to do modern democratic politics, because in a globalized world, there are factors which simply national parties cannot control, particularly in medium, small-sized states. The financial crisis is running through a thread in all of, at least in Europe, it's there. And the fact that it was never really properly addressed.
Problem is, it didn't hit in Poland. Yet Poland has. Chile went. into the populist
You
first
might
from
have to
left.
speak louder. I see people
Chile
straining to
went,
hear.
oh, I'm sorry. Chile went heavily into the populist politics, first from left and now from right, even though the government managed the China commodity boom quite well and sheltered the country from the post 2008. So I don't want to say that that the 2008 obviously was cataclysmic obtaining this. I think the immigration issue has been cataclysmic in precipitating. All I want to say is that those compound a structural weakening of the way democratic politics. That's the only thing. And if I had to look at one lever to move, it would not be the constitutional amendment, easy or hard, depending upon constitutional arrangement. It would be how to restructure the politics and political incentives.
Yeah, so I'm actually with you on overrating constitutions as a solution to all this. You know, that said, Chavez did bring in a new constitution in the first year. You know, so did Correa, so did Orban. That's one strategy. And the question is sort of why they do it. And I think that, you know, and I also agree with you about political parties collapsing. I mean, in all the countries that I'm studying, you see a collapse of the party system in advance of seeing a collapse of democratic institutions. But the question is, how do you get a general public to be mobilized politically without these institutions, right? So there used to be a kind of symbiotic relationship between parties and all these other social groups. This is the Peter Mayer argument for Europe, right? Which is that you lose all the clubs and associations and social bases of parties, and then the parties become bureaucratized, state funded, they hunt for people to represent and so on. So how do you, I mean, it's almost like a Durkheimian start with social clubs. But in this, you know, almost everywhere, those institutions cannot be really established if a state is hostile to them. And once you get, you know, a kind of nervous dictatorship of some kind digging itself in, it will be suspicious of all those forms of organization. So you need something to break out of that. So I guess I'm wondering, it strikes me that you have a bit of a chicken and egg kind of problem here. And I wonder which you think actually comes first and how you break out of autocratic capture, which takes as one of its signature elements ensuring that the population doesn't organize.
Very briefly answer.
Yeah.
So I think that you're absolutely right. We're in a chicken and egg moment, and we don't know which is which. That imagery. To my mind, the difficulty is we have these older institutions, political parties. They're weak, they're failing, and they don't seem dynamic enough for the moment. Some of the legal regimes that are country by country actually serve to weaken the parties relative to what they could be. So there are mild legal reforms, and I've wrote a piece of legislation on more direct funding to parties as opposed to candidates. But these are mild prods that maybe slow down the process of the disintegration. My primary fascination, though, is it's going to come along, and I don't see the shape of what it's going to look like yet. I mean, you know, we had 5-star in Italy, you know, that showed one model of one charismatic character and good media presence. I don't know.
I'd like to pick up on something else Sam said. You said you can't say or you don't know how disruptive social media has been. Whereas the European stance is that it is very, very disruptive. And I combine both social media and new technologies. You see the automated bots working on TikTok in the Romanian case. But you see in relation to migration, and this is proved, there are studies, and a rather famous American who ran a department for a while that I can't remember the name of the department, he's involved with this, when there's an incident, it certainly has happened in the UK and Ireland, the bots start working and directing traffic to the country and making the problem into an outsized problem, such that migration is now an obsession amongst European leaders, even in countries where it's actually not a problem. I mean, I discussed, I think, small boats with a member of Remarque. Small boats is an obsession in UK politics. It's already dictating policy and commitment to international legal obligations in relation to an election which is in 4 years' time. But in fact, small boats just bring in a few hundred thousands of people a year into a country that maybe has let in 1 million people in any given year. So in Europe, the position legislatively is we want to regulate this as part of our democratic shield. And of course, that is being met with huge resistance. There was a very big fine imposed on Elon Musk and X just this week.
Right.
And of course, the fear is that will attract a further negative reaction from the United States. But it is a very important factor in Europe. And because there's huge interference coming from certain states in relation to elections in Moldova, in Romania, etc.
Well, the only piece that I mildly disagree or have reservations about is there's no doubt that there's a lot of activity through bots. There's no doubt that attempts at interference through social media. The attempts to quantify how much effect it actually has on electoral behavior, such as there's a center here at NYU, a very good center run
Can you speak up?
that's run by Josh Tucker and Jonathan Engel. And what they find is that the penetration of these bots is actually quite low, and it's largely because of the networks by which they're transmitted, it's largely into preaching to the choir type activity. And so what we don't know is how much that's actually driving the politics as opposed to a feature of our politics. I think much more difficult which is harder to measure, is freeing politicians and commentators from institutional networks. They don't get filtered through media. They don't have to appeal through political parties. If you want to run for office now in the United States, it used to be you had to have the endorsement of the party, because otherwise you wouldn't get funds, you wouldn't get campaign workers, and so forth. Now, nobody would think going through the party apparatus because it's withered. And so I don't dispute that there's this hostile activity. And in Latin America, Russians don't speak good Spanish. They filter it all through Venezuela. Venezuela does the bots into all the Latin American elections, where Cubans do it. Venezuela's better.
Okay, thank you. Let's open up the floor.
I'm Robert Greeley. I'm a lecturer in constitutional law in the United Kingdom, and I used to lecture on populism just before the pandemic. Over the years, I've been reflecting upon this issue, and I think the thread that kind of ties together all the kind of speaker points is actually it's the economics and the perceived economics of this. I think what's driving the kind of populism in both Europe and America is a perceived sense of economic decline. And I was struck, and maybe Kim will know the author off the top of her head, maybe she can offer any insight about when she was in Hungary. But I was struck by this comment I read once about why Hungary and Poland kind of fell into the thralls of kind of an authoritarian populism. And he said that there was a perception that democracy would make them wealthy. And when it failed to materialize, the civic order just kind of crumbled beneath it. And then we could think about like Europe and America as declining economic forces. The future probably isn't with them. That sense of perceived decline begins to animate the politics in a very extreme way. And the reason I think about this is in the 1970s in Britain, there was a deep sense of economic decline, even though the average Briton lived a far better quality of living than they did at the height of the British Empire. But the concern was that this sense of economic decline was going to feed into a far-right movement, which would then take over the UK constitutional order and allow for an elective dictatorship, because that's what the UK constitution does. So I think it's the constitutional fantasy, building on Sam's point, is that it is about it's this economic sense of prosperity. And unless something changes economically, we're going to go down this track even further. I mean, we might not fall into authoritarian populism, but the sense of political agitation will get worse. And the only thing that stopped that sense of economic decline in the 1970s, turned out it was Margaret Thatcher, but it wasn't really Margaret Thatcher. It was a change in the way the global financial order just happened to work in the 1980s that benefited Britain. So I guess my point is, I think it's the economics that's here. It's underneath the surface of everything. And I think we should perhaps be more aware of that.
Let's collect 3 or 4, and if you would follow the good, I will call on you. Just give me a second. Will you follow the good example of identifying yourselves when you? So you and
yeah, I wanted to jump up to you.
speak up.
Yeah, I wanted to jump up to Robert's comment. I'm Hector Robert Bofi. I teach constitutional law in Barcelona, but I don't want to talk about Spanish constitutional law, in spite of the allusions. I think, as Robert, that there is something that is missing in the picture. The blocks, the stable blocks that Sam has mentioned, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the civic associations, the trade unions, all those agents brought us to the 2008 crisis. That was the real collapse began with the economic collapse, and they began to collapse when that happened, and Viktor Orban is a product of the 2008 crisis, and at least Viktor Orban took the trouble of changing the constitution, because another thing that I've missed in your analysis is the comparison of what has happened in the time before, in which the Western democracies faced up such challenges, which was in the 30s of the 20th century. I'm saying that at least Viktor Orban changed the constitution because Adolf Hitler didn't. And I wanted to know also your opinion, your vision of those parallelisms between those both historical instances that you have not mentioned. What would be different from 2008 that happened in, let's say, from 1929?
Wonderful. I'm Daniel Quiroga Llamarin, and I'm a Hauser Remarque Fellow here at the Institute. I just wanted to make more explicit the connection between democratic politics and foreign policy. I think that was very explicit in Scheppele's newspaper, which she mentioned that part of the angst is related to how allies are mistreated, and democratic allies, liberal allies in particular. But I did feel that it would be good to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I think that, for instance, the Cold War underpins a big part of the social democrat, social Christian understanding. It is without the Cold War that kind of thing came to unravel in a way. And in particular, I wanted to ask about the connection between that kind of geopolitical foreign policy dimension and multi-level systems. Because as much as I agree with the two of you that multi-level systems are important both in Europe and in the Americas, I'm also very concerned about how those multi-level systems obviously have a geopolitical agenda. So Marco Duranti has written beautifully about the anti-communist origins of the European system of human rights on the Council of Europe. In the Americas, we know quite a lot about its role in the policy of Cuba, for instance, 662 and beyond. So I want to bring those two things a little bit together in this conversation.
Last question in this round.
Yeah, Turku Shiksel, I teach political science at Columbia. I have a question about the decline that prompted by Sam's remark about the decline of parties. I think it's Julia Azari's term, the sort of weak party, strong partisanship kind of paradox. And in some of these backsliding countries, we see the weak party phenomenon that you're pointing to, Sam, or like the, and I think it's definitely tied to democracy coming under strain. But we don't see strong partisanship in the same way everywhere. We see it in the US, but, you know, it's more like voters are still kind of, you know, fungible between parties or sort of party affiliations are more fluid in other places. So I wondered what you think about that, how that paradox might play into this. And I also wanted to ask about opposition, about, you know, when we look at democratically backsliding situations, we see the opposition in disarray in situations where we might think that, like, there's a very kind of strong case to be made by the opposition, and yet inexplicably the opposition is in disarray. And I wonder whether you think of that, and this is a question for all of the panelists, is whether you think of that as a symptom or a cause, right, as a sort of particular enabling condition for democratic backsliding, or these backsliders wrong-foot the opposition in a particular way that keeps them from being able to get their act together and kind of mount an effective message. We see the Democrats in the United States like cycling between the three options of fight on democracy, fight on the substantive issues, or don't fight, roll over and play dead. And there doesn't seem to be like a clear winner in that conversation cycle of options.
Okay, ball's in your court. Really?
I'll be very brief. I mean, just to say to Hector and Robert, I agree with you. And that's why I included in my question to Sam the financial crisis. I think it's running there. And you made the point that Poland didn't suffer in the same way. Poland went from a system of absolute security and equality to a system of insecurity and at least perceived inequality. And now, because of this, the inequality is just so in people's faces. It was hidden before, it's not anymore. So I do agree with you that this decline in political parties and the splintering of the traditional parties, at least in the countries I know well, and that's Ireland and Spain, both of which were countries referred to as pigs, which is a term in Europe to describe Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and not a term to describe female journalists, I should add.
Yes.
In these countries, it had an absolutely incredible impact on the traditional parties on left and right. And that impact is still playing out, very, very uncertain outcomes. So for me, the economics and the real and perceived inequality, and I think we have to accept there is very real inequality. It's not just a perception. Yes, people are much wealthier in Ireland than my grandparents and parents were, but the inequality in society is now massive compared to what it was. And I think there's a very important connection, Daniel, between democratic politics and foreign policy. And I did dare to put that front and center in my contagion basket, because I am afraid to say that with great, great power in this world goes great, great responsibility. And as a person whose country admired American constitutionalism and the miracle of this country, and a country that brought in many, many Irish people, I find it really tragic to see that the pot is being stirred with such force, but with such deliberate destruction. Because, I mean, I'm not saying that the European Union or Europe or the Council of Europe are perfect, not at all. And they have their agendas and they're not always positive ones. But if you take a broad historical perspective in Europe, what has happened in the last 75 years is a miracle. And those who want to destroy that miracle, I'm not on your team. And I will use the rest of my professional life and hopefully living breath to defend that miracle, because it wasn't a pleasant thing that these institutions were born from. For me, and I'm not a political scientist, but I am a politics junkie. For me, it's cause. How do you talk back in objective, rational, factual terms to an onslaught which is deliberately irrational, not objective, and not factual? I experienced it as the court president, because the migration in the period I was a judge, we went through the migration crisis, the invasion of Ukraine first time round and second time round, the interstate cases relating to Georgia and Ukraine, the Brexit, the first Trump administration, the global pandemic. And again, as I said, the invasion of Ukraine was a major issue. And yet there are governments that are now speaking very openly, including in the UK, of pulling out of the convention system. And why? You ask why in the UK. Well, it's apparently because these judges do a terrible job. If you tell them the facts, There are one violation found against the United Kingdom of 330 cases in 2024. Is this really a terrible system that's doing terrible injustice? You come at it even with learned politicians and in academic circles with facts, and the facts they're not grasping anymore. People talk about a phenomenon which is, I think, from wrestling, which is called kayfabe. Just make things up as you go. We see it daily in the news. And there are some politicians who are very good at doing that. And how do you grasp that? How do you respond to the manner of doing politics nowadays? I think that's very difficult. And it's one reason why in many systems, a lot of fairly young politicians are leaving politics, and women are leaving in droves because of trawling, because of threats, and because of this inability to gain traction with other politicians and the public. So for me, it's pause, but the others may have a different view.
Yeah, so I have so when we were rehearsing what we were going to do on the panel, Sam and I had a minor tussle over who got to cover political parties. So I'm going to pull back the topic of political parties, overlap with some of Sam's insights, but also take it in a slightly different direction that I think answers almost all the questions, which is in addition to the secular trends that Sam was talking about, which is, it's called the bowling alone phenomenon in American political science, but the general decline of civic institutions which grounded political parties. There's also something else, and that is economic globalization. And economic globalization, of course, at EU, this is part of the hostility to the EU, which is your economic fate as a country is tied now massively to other countries' economic fates. And some of that is official and legal, as in the case of the EU. Some of that is because globalization has, outsourced manufacturing to the cheapest bidder and, all those forces that we know about. Those forces have undermined the class structure on which a lot of the social structure was built, which is to say it's extremely difficult now in most advanced democracies to actually say what the working class is anymore. Because many of them are gig workers or small employers because they got spun off from companies, or they're intermittent workers of different kinds. Ditto with the middle class, which is to say it's also precarious when it wasn't precarious. So economic inequality is a part of that, but it's also that you have sort of unstable class formations. And that also undermines this idea that there's a sort of right-wing party defending, sort of manufacturers or, the economic elites, and a labor party defending. So it's also these changes in class structures wrought by globalization, because while what you have now is international distribution of class structures, not so much clear class structures within one society. So that also undermines political parties. And so what's happening now, because national governments don't really control a lot of what their economic policy is. Certainly that's true in the EU, which has yoked everybody together, but it's even true, as we saw in the pandemic when supply chains got disrupted, that, basically no country governs its own economy completely. So that being the case, politics has also migrated away from kind of left-right economic issues that went with more enclosed economies and more stable class structures into identity issues that you switch to, to abortion, to affirmative action, just taking the US issues, or you switch to nationalism or to migration, or issues that national governments can still control, away from the economic issues that used to underwrite the old party structure. Okay, now, when that happens, what it needs is a reorientation of a party structure. And I think the emerging orientation, which has been said by many people in different forms, is that political identification now moves along an axis from more or less cosmopolitan to nationalist. The thing is that there are cosmopolitans in parties of the left, universal human rights folks that we all know and love, right? But there's also cosmopolitan folks in the parties of the right, namely the free traders and folks who are in favor of this kind of division of labor globalization. In parties of the left and right, you also get nationalists. So to take the US example, you get a Bernie Sanders, if you're going to actually have let's say Denmark, the sort of social democrats of Denmark, if you're going to have a really generous social state, you have to close borders, right? You just can't have. And so there are sort of economic nationalists in the left. They're also the sort of ethno-nationalists of the right parties. So what you're seeing is the parties are fracturing along those lines, and you don't yet see an emergence of cosmopolitan and nationalist parties. So I think it's one of these betwixt and between different forms of political orientation. And I thought Germany was going to make a soft landing because you were seeing the Greens rise up to take over the socialists. You were seeing the Free Democrats kind of rising up to take over the CDU. You could see, and now that's sort of crashed, right? So the question is what a new party system would look like. And this is just to go through the question. I mean, so economic decline. So what you see, the world as a whole has gotten more equal. Individual countries are the ones that have gotten more unequal. So we have to sort of think about how to do a politics around that. Foreign policy, there's certain things you can touch and certain things you can't touch. It's extremely, what Trump's tariff war is doing, which is very interesting, is disrupting the trade system for the first time. Nobody really has tried to do that. And nobody really quite knows what to make of it. But, you know, that was the sacred part that you couldn't touch. Because anyways, for all these reasons, so foreign policy was hardwired in by a certain form of globalization. You know, and I think on the opposition is in disarray. It's because of the fact that a left party now contains in it different elements that are at war with each other. And we just see that every time something comes up. So I do think that political parties are a future answer. And the question is how you build a new set of parties around the new axes that are available in a globalized world for getting enough, you know, unity within and difference between, that you can develop a voting system that people have real choices that are realizable at national level without having some of those parties be anti-democratic. That answers all of them, right?
So, the economic point is well taken. I start my book with the economics of decline in democracies. I reproduce famous elephant curve from the World Bank, shows that the 20-year period of globalization was the greatest transfer of wealth from the wealthy to the poor countries of the world, or from the wealthier to the poorer parts of humanity that we've ever had. So from a normative point of view, I'm 100% behind it. Problem is how you cushion it, because the only groups that did worse during that period was the laboring classes of the advanced countries. And that's where the populists have taken hold. The only slight difference, I've been looking at polling data, and I saw this case that poll did last weekend from the United States. And what's fascinating is inequality never appears as a factor. It's insecurity does. Inequality is not, you know, that the billionaire classes do. You just don't see it. You don't see it in the polling. And it's quite a striking thing. And I've seen in Europe similar kinds of polling, that the way in which the educated political class thinks it should be translated has not taken hold. And instead, it's really, you know, what about my Social Security? What about this? I think that there's let me 2 points to. One is, I think an unspoken presupposition of democracy is optimism. I think you have to believe that fits and starts, we're getting better. And I know that in my lifetime, I've seen only 3 periods of optimism that I can identify. One, I was very young, the 1960s. There's a sense for all the terrible things that are going on, people could make a difference in the world, things could get better. After 1989, in the United States, the election for the first time of a post-World War II generation to the presidency was a period of real optimism. And at least for me personally, to be part of the campaign of the first Black man elected president was a transformation that I never would have imagined in the United States. These were moments of real optimism and the sense that life will get better. What you're missing now in country after country is any sense of optimism from the mass of the population. They don't think their children will live a better life than they have. They don't think that the society is addressing the concerns that they have, so on and so forth. So that's the challenge, is to find a political expression for that, which is not simply nihilistic, which is not simply tear down the other institutions that stand in the way of me grabbing as much as I can right now, or my partisans grabbing as much as I can. On the partisanship point, let me make the same point in reverse. It's amazing how big a price we pay for the lack of effective political institutions. Let me give you an example at the constitutional level. We have major cases in the Supreme Court right now involving the extent of executive power under President Trump. Why do we have so many right now? Because the second Trump administration, unlike the first Trump administration, is very sophisticated legally. You may find that shocking for me to say, but they know what they're doing. And so I had
Orban factor.
well, Chavez was there, and I'll give you my man Juan Perón any day for somebody who could abuse legal systems for partisan gain. But one of the things that the Trump folks did was they sat together. Part of this was the Project 2025, but a lot of it was just the people who immediately took power. They said, what did we do wrong the first time? And it was, we started talking about shithole countries. We started tweeting about banning Muslims and all this. And then it all got struck down by the courts. This time, we're going to do it legally. What does that mean? There are 7 statutes that grant ill-defined emergency powers to the president. 7. Those 7, they figure they could run the entire operation through those 7 statutes. Some of them are a badly crafted statute at the time of the Arab oil embargo. What's the answer to that? I'll come back to that in a second. A second one, more absurd, is a statute authorizing President Adams to take means necessary to stop the French from stealing our seamen and impressing them into the French Navy at a time when there was no communication. It was 6 months before the president could send an order to the fleet. What's the problem? They define emergency simply in terms of what the president believes to be an emergency. Lunacy. Machiavelli wrote brilliantly about how you cannot have this as a form of political organization. What's the answer to it? The answer to it is these are stupid statutes which have outlived their usefulness. Congress, get in there and say what you want to delegate and what you don't, what the powers are, and then we can have this kind of dicey and accord about what men of good faith or women of good faith now will agree to put into place. But we don't have any institutions that have more than a week's worth of political foresight available to them in our partisan environment. And so it's a chicken and egg problem, but a lot of what we're seeing play out in the courts is a constitutional question right now, should never be in the courts. This should be handled in the most expedient way possible, which is Congress saying exactly what is the emergency? Do we have an emergency off the coast of Venezuela? Can we start shooting people who are clinging to life rafts? In the first instance, that's the institute.
I wish we had more time for questions, but we do not. Will you join me in thanking Pat for the fascinating discussion?